Good morning. Good morning. That's more like Harvard Business School. Walking around the last 2 days, it's really struck me how wonderful it is and what a privilege it is to be a member of this extraordinary community that we call Harvard Business School. Today, it's my added privilege to moderate a discussion on leadership in the 21st century with this august panel in front of this very august audience. If you're a leader today, I think you might finally understand this wonderful Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. Of course, when the Chinese said it to you, they didn't mean it as good wishes, but a curse. These are indeed interesting times for us to discuss leadership because the confidence that the public has in our leaders has been deeply shaken. And it's a time when everybody is looking for more leadership, better leadership in all walks of life. As an institution that has devoted itself to the mission of developing leaders who can make a difference in the world, I must add parenthetically that some of my colleagues say that we should modify this to say a positive difference in the world. These are times when we should also pause and reflect on how we are doing, whether we had a role in any way in the events that have transpired, and what we can do to adapt and continue to respond and develop the kinds of leaders that the world really needs. To discuss these challenges and what we can do at Harvard Business School, we are fortunate to have on our panel a remarkable group of leaders representing some of the most important sectors of the global economy. Let me quickly introduce them and then get into our discussion. First, on my extreme left, Jaime, MBA class of 1982, chairman and CEO of JPMorgan Chase, the leader of an institution that bears the name of perhaps the greatest financier in history, a firm that under his leadership has emerged as one of the strongest financial institutions in the midst of the recent financial crisis. Next to him, Orit, Gadiesh, MBA class of 1977, chairman of Bain and Company, who has been a perennial fixture on various lists of the most powerful women in the world. She is one of the most trusted advisors to leaders of major corporations around the world, and an extraordinary leader in her own right of a leading global consulting firm, a sector that attracts many of our graduates. Next to her, Rick Wagoner, MBA class of 1977, chairman and CEO of General Motors, the company that is most closely associated with the American industrial sector. It was once famously said that as goes GM, so goes America. And it now seems that if America is to retain a future in manufacturing, it will mean leaders like Rick finding a solution to the extraordinary challenges facing his company. And finally, Jaime Zobel, MBA class of 1987, CEO and chairman of Ayala Corporation, one of the largest diversified business groups in the Philippines, who represents the opportunities that are exploding in emerging markets and the extraordinary role that leaders like him are playing in help realizing these opportunities. So I'm going to start by asking our leaders to look back and share with us an event in their lives that most influenced their development as leaders. We're going to try and get the conversation today to be much more about their role personally as leaders. We will then move on and ask them to discuss the role of leadership in the current crisis and the challenges that they have personally faced. And finally, we will look to the future and get their advice on what they think we ought to be doing to continue to adapt as an institution and better educate leaders in the future. So why don't I start with Rick and have you start us off. Rick, as you look back in your life, what would you think of as an event or an experience that most defined you as a leader?
Yeah, other than the last month, I presume we like the context to be in. I should say as I start, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with such distinguished colleagues, and I note that General Motors celebrated its 100th anniversary last month. I would have observed that HBS and General Motors probably could have picked a better year to do that in. But anyway, we're all here. Yeah, if I think back over my career, probably the event or circumstance that had the biggest impact on me was about 20 years ago. I was given the opportunity to run our operation in Brazil. Prior to that, I'd had a number of interesting jobs around the world, but none is really the top person. And I think probably for many of you in the audience, that first assignment where you're running your own business, you realize it is different being perhaps the top person than even having a key role in a business. And in that particular circumstance, the state of the company was not very good down there. As you may recall, back in the old days, Brazil used to go up and down like this every several years. And so we were in one of those downs, and I had the opportunity to work in Brazil 7 or 8 years before that. So I was fortunate to know somewhat of the country and our management team there. And what I learned from that experience there, bottom line, is we went in and we had to make a number of changes, and actually had the opportunity to bring to bear the resources of General Motors around the world from colleagues I had worked with, whether in the U.S. or Europe or other parts of the world. So bringing in product development expertise or purchasing expertise or whatever, it really brought home to me, I think, first and foremost, what a difference one could make in running a business or an activity, but most importantly, how that's done. And in this case, being able to rely on really terrific people and resources, in our case, of our company around the world to bring to bear on a specific circumstance there really taught me the importance of effective leadership, an aspect of effective leadership being able to engage people and leverage resources effectively, as opposed to try to do things for yourself. I might add that, so we made a whole bunch of changes, still lost a lot of money. I was transferred back to Detroit, and the guy who replaced me, Mark Hogan, HBS 77, then proceeded to make a lot of money down there. We've argued ever since who was responsible for that. But anyway.
Jamie, do you?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example, which is not an example of leadership, but something I think you learn a lot from a lot of things. It's hard to pick one thing, but I was fired from my job after working for someone for 17 years. And so here's some kind of lessons, kind of today looking back, because I'm not sure I knew them all at the time. Number one is, like I told my kids when I got fired, that it was my net worth, not my self-worth, involved in the company, and that you're still a person regardless of your job, and you still have responsibilities with family, et cetera. Number two, a lot of people said to me at the time, you took it too personally. Maybe you learned a lesson that you should be a little more removed from the job. And looking back, I think that's the exact wrong thing. I think you got to take your job personally. It's your team. You got to bleed your team's colors. I see a lot of CEOs now, and they talk about their company like it's a third party, like it's somebody else. I think that's a terrible error. And I think the people inside the company start to treat the company the same way. Like it's really nothing's that big a deal, because this isn't our team, this isn't our jersey, this is kind of a more too professional a job. I was told back then, you find out who your friends are. Again, I learned a different lesson than other people, that all of my friends who were my friends before, my friends after. And a lot of them, a lot of folks who I considered friends joined me at my next company. And I guess the last lesson I learned is this, and I think it's highly misguided in corporate America, about loyalty. When people look at me and say, Jimmy, I'm loyal to you, it kind of makes me nervous, because they should really be loyal to the institution. If they look at you and say they're loyal to the principles for which you stand, I think that's a good thing. And so a lot of people joined, when you're the boss, you obviously have to make decisions that everyone agrees with, but really senior, mature people, they want to make sure that they were part of the debate and treated respectfully. And when you make a decision they don't agree with, at least you gave them the reasons why, as opposed to, I'm the boss and that's it. So I think you attract far better people when you treat them with trust and respect, and they know they're going to be part of the debate.
Orit?
Well, I agree with Jamie. There are a lot of things one can think about. I can think back to when I was in the military. Actually, I probably learned the most. But during my career, I guess in 1990, Bain and Company almost went bankrupt. And it was actually a complete surprise to just about everybody who was there. There's nothing wrong with their business principles or business model, client relationships. What happened was that the founders cashed out and put a burden of debt on the company that the company could not pay, not unlike some things we're seeing now. And it became public very quickly because of the media. Forbes, Wall Street Journal, consultant, heal thyself, those kind of things. You couldn't get away from that. And that caused very quickly for clients to wonder about what was going on, say nothing about potential clients, for recruits legitimately ask about it. Every headhunter was calling every single one of our employees. And consulting firms have very few, professional service firms have very few assets. They have their clients, their people, and their reputation, and all three were in complete jeopardy. A small group of us decided to get together and stick together and try to turn it around. And without getting into too much detail, the reason was that we believed that the principles and values that underlined what made Bain & Company great, independent of that financial condition we were in, were still valid and are worth fighting for. And I think many of you have been through things like that. What we had to do was negotiate with four banks, negotiate with our founders, deal with bad publicity, try to convince our clients to stay with us, get new clients, convince recruits to come, keep our best people, come up with a new governance structure that will actually make us survive. And we came out of it to tell a story that actually I think very few professional service firms were able to do. In fact, we had talked to investment bankers before that, and they mostly told us to forget about it. I still remember one quote in particular: "Why bother? You don't have a prayer." You can imagine why this had a lot of impact on the way I think, my colleagues think, our company thinks. It has shaped us. But let me add one thing that was less intuitive to me at the time, and was really actually quite important. Once we had turned around the business, if you will, and straightened out our finances, so we had a business turnaround and a financial turnaround, those of us who were involved day to day in doing this sort of felt great relief and felt we could get on. And all of a sudden I realized that something was really, really missing. And then it struck me that as a firm, we had lost our collective pride. I don't think anybody lost their pride in what they were doing individually, or they wouldn't have stayed there. But as a firm, we have lost this feeling that you are special, which is, especially in professional service firms where all your internal assets are people, is critical. And I think we were lucky that in our case, our pride had to do with, until then, had to do with the principle and values of the way we serve our clients, not just with being profitable or how fast we grew. But the financial crisis, I mean, really almost having gone bankrupt, has completely dented any pride that anybody had in Bain & Company, almost destroyed it. And the way it came to my mind was that it wasn't enough to have a business turnaround and a financial turnaround, that we needed a third turnaround, what I called a pride turnaround, which you wonder how you do. And one of the things that was pivotal was that I actually decided to do just that. We had a company meeting. I decided to give a speech to the company meeting that will try to do just that. It was the first speech at Bain & Company ever that didn't have a single number in it. Can you imagine standing in front of a bunch of consultants and having not a single number in it? But what I tried to do, since those principles and values have not actually changed, the ones I talked about, that's why people stayed with us. That's why our clients stuck with us. This is why we're able to do that. I tried to convey in that and talk about what has not changed. So I didn't talk about our new balance sheet. I talked about the work we do. I didn't talk about what we say our commitment is to our clients. I talked about what our clients say about our commitment to them. I talked about our principles and values, but without mentioning them, by reminding people in the room how they went about making choices and decisions during the tough times. And I ask people not to take for granted what other people really admire this company for. I didn't ask anybody to do or say anything, but I asked them to take a moment, think about what they feel, and then project it. And the reaction was instantaneous. It was like everybody realized at the same time the importance and worth of those values and principles that had once made Bain Company what it was, and now have again allowed us to come through. And that really was the last part of the turnaround. That has defined a lot of what we as a company and I as a part of the leadership of the company have learned through that.
Thank you. Jaime.
Thanks, Nitin. In my case, a little bit different to what was discussed. When I think back, an important point, I guess, in my view of business and my whole concept of building trust, both with an organization and with a community, really came back when I came back from the business school back in '87 to the Philippines. The Philippines, country of 88 million people, 30% live below the poverty line. Another way of looking at it is 90% of all households in the Philippines earn maybe about $600 a month or less, yet have the purchasing power for 60%, I guess, of all purchases in the country. So a very different environment to the one I found myself in the business school. We were looking at sophisticated models, looking at very developed country infrastructures and ways of solving problems that involve a lot of sophistication. And I came back to a very different environment. And there and then, it struck me really upon landing and in the first weeks of working back in my country that there was a component missing in the business equation I'd picked up at the business school. And I felt it very profoundly. On one hand, I felt I had some new tools, some new ways of looking at things, but the whole reality of the economic environment I was faced with was radically different. The whole concept of institutions growing, building market share, becoming important here in the United States. You know, people are lauded, they're respected as they grow in size. In the Philippines, trust breaks down. You're mistrusted if you're too large an entity within the kind of environment we have, where there's this disparity in income. And it made me think hard, Nitin, about some of the lessons I'd learned, but I really felt that there were significant lessons and significant parts of the equation missing. And I proceeded to just adjust really through gut feel and add some new elements into the equation. A social development agenda became very important to me, and it started to run parallel to the way I ran the business. It was there in parallel, not integrated in any way, and began to sort of come out in different ways of building trust with these new communities. One example, for example, we're with a group in many businesses in the Philippines, but real estate has been something that's been very close to the history of our company. We won a large property in the second largest city in the Philippines, and we won it from a government auction. It was very large, and with it came a lot of informal settlers. And the government told us, look, you've won fair and square, and we will give you support with police, et cetera, to get rid and evacuate and ask the informal settlers to leave. And if we need to use force, so be it. And I felt right from the very start, this is wrong. I mean, the law is on your side, but you're immediately going to create tension in a community where you're coming in to begin with. And so we started with a whole new concept of lessening that tension right off, which the law said it was on my side. We could remove the squatters, but we said, no, let's not do that. Let's not start off on that position. And we worked with the foundation and people who knew about working with informal settlers, building communities. We worked with the government and said, do you have land that's extra? They found land. And we found a way of relocating the squatters and bringing them to a whole new area. We helped organize themselves. We gave them land that they could then own. And it was a cost. It was a cost element that was unforeseen in the purchase of this property. But 3 years later, we built a whole set of new dynamics with that community. What started off as a very low trust environment became one of trust. And we were able to do many other things in that environment because of this social development agenda we were able to add in. There were many other examples as we moved on, but over the years, after that key moment of realization, what's happened in our group is that we brought the social development agenda to work more closely with the strategic intent of the company. And what was gut feel for me at the time, and we began to develop it as just an instinct, I was pleasantly surprised. I was invited by the Harvard Business School to join their visiting committee, and I would touch on this topic. And at the very beginning, there wasn't much resonance in the group as we discussed these things. But then over time, I found myself actually by luck and by accident in a breakout group of one of these visiting committees and ran into, I guess, the social enterprise group, which was founded by Jim Austin, Kash Rangan, and Michael Chu. And I suddenly saw an intellectual framework that was beginning to shape up at the business school with respect to this merging of the social development agenda and the strategic intent. And that fundamentally began to change the way I did things in the Philippines, and that interaction as well with the business school helped me put a framework, an intellectual framework around what was originally an instinct. And since then, it's basically transformed the way we do business. In a country like ours, you're really, as you grow a business, you're really dealing with people and touching people and customers at much lower levels than the income scale. Dealing with them, building trust with these communities. We're in water distribution. We deal with people in very, very poor communities. On the cell phone business, we're the second largest mobile operator. Selling cell phones to people at the low end of the income scale is radically different to anything that you've done on the top end. And so those were my key moments, just a realization that a social development agenda could be integrated into strategy and become a very powerful force for success in a country like ours. I've always believed in the capitalist system. I believe that it's a way to bring a country forward. But I have to admit that when I came back to the Philippines at the time, a significant component of a successful equation, as I felt it, was missing, and that's evolved over time. A lot of it with dialogues that I've had with the business school as well.
Yeah. Now, as I've listened to all of you, just striking how much these moments that were difficult moments in various ways, in your case being fired, in your case the moment of bankruptcy, in your case taking on a very difficult circumstance in Brazil, in your case dealing with the possibility of how to evacuate these settlers, that it has so profoundly shaped your values, your sense of purpose, how you think about the relationship between yourself and your companies. In some sense, we are now collectively living through a moment that has that feel. And I'm curious, as you've lived through it, this particular set of events, in what ways, what leadership lessons, perhaps it's too early to even draw them, but if you can, what leadership lessons have you begun to draw from the current events, both personally as you've led through them, but also collectively that we might be able to take forward? Jaime, as you've been in the thickest of this, maybe you want to get us started?
Yeah, so, first of all, I think the principles of good leadership don't change in a crisis or not. I think there are certain things you have to emphasize. If you don't, they're fatal flaws. You will die. So I'll go through a couple which I think are really important. And I think there are all these different management styles, and they're all different. So I don't say it's got to be one way or the other to be successful in a crisis and not a crisis. But I think there are some which, if you don't do right, you will fail. One is I'm going to talk about an open environment. That means when you have meetings, that everyone who comes to me can speak up, speak their mind without fear of retaliation or people saying that's not true or being very defensive. And the people have to be honest. I was at a meeting one time and someone said, you need, if you're a CEO, you need around you one truth teller, someone who will always tell you the truth no matter what. To which I said, if you are a CEO and you have 10 people around you and only one is a truth teller, you should fire the other 9. Okay, you need everyone to speak up to the best of their ability and to have done their homework and to be honest about it. So, JPMorgan, people know I always talk about the management slide that says, we suck less. But we made a lot of mistakes too, and I think you have to kind of be honest about what you did wrong, what you're going to do about it, how you fit in, and it gives you a chance to respond. I think you have to really prioritize. I am shocked at the amount of people, they're watching that train coming down the tracks, and they're still worrying about their strategic plan for 2009 or we cancel all that stuff, all of it. Meetings, trips, travel, you may name it, to focus on the fact that we're in the middle of a real crisis. You better have a sense of urgency. Again, I'm surprised that people don't have it. You have to have fortitude, and I heard Jay Light mention before the ability to act. A lot of people don't have the ability to act, and it's hard to act. A lot of these acts you take, particularly in a crisis, are admissions of your own failure. We bought X, we were wrong, we're going to sell it, we're going to take a loss, we've got to tell the shareholders. They don't want to tell the shareholders, they don't admit they're wrong, and so you sit there, and these problems don't age well. And so you have to have You have to have an awful lot of fortitude to do not just yourself, but the whole management team, to do the right thing, to make that right decision, and to take the pain and whatever that is. And again, I am surprised at the lack of fortitude on the parts of some people, just to figure out the right thing and then to do it. And it's hard to do it, like everybody else, And when I go to sleep on a Friday night, I'm grateful I'm not going to work the next day, and I would love to avoid all the problems next week. I would love to do anything other than deal with what I have to deal with. So fortitude is a really hard thing. You have to be very disciplined, and I put this, it's even more important in a crisis. So our management team, there's about 15, actually not 15 people, like 30 people, every day, 7:30, 12, 5 o'clock, what's going on, sharing information, kind of making some decisions on the spot, reviewing facts and information. But this discipline, again, I'm always surprised at companies who don't have discipline. They don't have business views, they're not looking at the competitors, and this is not like revenues are expensive, so whatever's important. Process, systems, people, hiring, retention, client service levels, and a regular, consistent review of where you stand, why you're there, and again, very honest about it. And the last one I'd put down, and I'd say you got to set your own standards. And the standards, it's very easy to fall back on the standard that's the way it is for everybody. And as opposed to say, we want to be really good. And honestly, that standard is going to be set by the CEO. If you want mediocrity, believe me, that's what you're going to get if you don't set a high standard. And you'll never meet that high standard. And I also would add the one thing, the standard of integrity. You set a high standard in that company, and you mean it, and you act on it. And again, I've seen a lot of situations where people say they want act with integrity, but they don't fire the top salesman who lied to a client. So you got to set that standard and actually act on it.
Rick?
I agree with what he said.
That's a great Harvard Business School line.
It is, particularly when you didn't read the case.
But as a good instructor, I have to say, and then, what do you think?
Did I ever tell you about the time first year I was called on all 3 cases, to open all 3 cases one day?
Well, this is another occasion.
That's right. I would just add to what Jaime said. These are incredibly unusual times. I think it really calls on everybody to go back to a lot of fundamentals that, to be honest, you get going in a business that's growing and global and very driven by a massive technology change, and that's kind of the way the whole team's going, because that looks like the path to win. And then all of a sudden, somebody blows the whistle and credit stops flowing, and it really requires you to stop and say, now let's think about this business one more time. We build this unit and we sell it to the dealer. Well, where does the dealer get the money to pay us, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's been a real time for us to reflect back to the basics. I'd rather have gotten there another way, but I think we have to view these as an opportunity to say, well, if we focus our efforts there, what can we do to address some of the historical things that have developed that in the end aren't very healthy business practices. And I've been either elated to see all the things we've been able to fix, or chagrined to find out how dumb we got to be in a number of areas over the years. Let me give you an example. Canadian market, auto market, is a good-sized market, not huge, generally operates in a lower price point than the U.S., and for some reason got to be tremendously weighted to leasing, which over the years got to be tremendously unprofitable. And so now we've stopped leasing in Canada. But you say, what in the world were we all, everyone in our industry, thinking about putting in a business model that inherently wasn't very profitable? Why were we doing that? So these are, I say this as an example just to say these are chances to go back to the basics and really focus in and kind of clean up the baseline of your business. To do that, though, does require that you take some of the stuff that were, maybe your own big ideas of 3 months ago, and maybe they're still good ideas, but they need to be put in the icebox or slowed down. And that's sometimes a hard thing to do, but not reacting to those quickly can be fatal, and I think very much in line with what Jaime says. The last thing that I have been somewhat gratified to find out, we've had to make massive cuts really over a period of time, but particularly in the most recent period, how much your employees, in our case we have a huge dealer body, they kind of understand. They don't like it, but if you sit down and explain, hey, this is what we need to do, this is why, this is, by the way, what we don't know about what's going to happen tomorrow, and that uncertainty is leading us to make these decisions today, that even though it entails, in a lot of cases, significant personal sacrifice for these people affected, they say, yeah, I mean, I see what you're doing, and I'd rather you not, but if that's what we need to do to make it, that, we'll get behind that, and, they will line up behind you. A critical element of that, though, and we learned this kind of day one at HBS, and whenever we forget it, we learn it with a vengeance. The critical aspect of effective communications is multiplied in a difficult time that we're in.
How do you get people to, confidence, people say, is a really important thing that leaders have to impart in the people in their organizations. And how do you create confidence at a time when people, genuinely look at firms that nobody thought would ever go down, have gone down, and they must at some point privately wonder, is there a future for GM? Is there a future, you've come out well from this, but it's nowhere near the end of the situation. Any advice that you would have for leaders who are out there and companies where people might be asking the same question of themselves as to, because we're still in the middle of it. It feels like a storm. Nobody knows where the boundaries of this is. How do you help people develop some sense of confidence during these times?
Yeah, I would just say, I think, honesty and candor is incredibly important. You can't just say, though, we're really toast guys. You have to be offering some solutions for that. But I think people want to hear it as plain as you can give it to them. I would also say for the leaders here and many of you, you don't develop your leadership position in one day. It's developed over years, and if one works hard and does it in the right way, you build up some credibility with the people that you lead, and it's time like this that you can use that credibility, and people will say, okay, if she or he is saying we've got to do this, even though I don't know everything or it doesn't feel good, I'll go along because I have confidence and trust in them. And so this is the time for leaders to use the credibility they've built up with their key constituents.
Orit, would you have any advice this time?
Well, the first advice I would have is, this thing has flashed now 3 times saying, would Ms. Gadiesh please speak up? I think somebody should come up with something that actually fits for women as opposed to this thing that fits only for men, which I just dropped, incidentally, because my tie is not on. So I hope you can hear me. I cannot shout. I'm not done that, but those in the back, please do help. Let me go back for a moment, because I think we use the word leadership we use the word leadership and reuse the word leadership. I think both gentlemen have said very good things about what leadership is. But 100 years ago, there was a pretty eminent economic historian. Can people hear me now, by the way? Thank you. If you don't, make some noise, and the guys behind will fix it. And that economic historian said that they were really 3 major things that were the key characters of true leaders. And he called it at the time courage, good judgment, and empathetic pact, I think. In today's jargon, that would be really the willingness to, the ability to get it right, the ability to get it done, the character and integrity that you talked about, and I think the last one really I've interpreted as empathy. Now, that man was actually the first dean of Harvard Business School, Edwin F. Gay, who said it in 1908 when the business school was opened. I don't think that much has changed in terms of what leadership is. And I've heard a lot of people this morning, yesterday, although you said the same thing, you said the opposite of that, that leadership has to change. No, I don't think leadership has to change. I think we need more of the same, independent of exactly how we call it. And I think it's actually rather important, so let me make a distinction. Just because you're the boss, and that relates back to what you also said, just because you're a boss it doesn't mean that you're a leader. It first means that you're a ruler. You may become a leader later on, but there's a big difference between the two. And just like political rulers use hard military power, for example, business rulers use hard economic power, like bonuses or saying, excuse me, but I don't want to hear you, or whatever it is. And on the other hand, true leaders rarely have to use those tools because they accomplish something that's much more rare. And they usually are practitioners of what Joe Nye, who is across the river, but very relevant to this, of what Joe Nye calls soft power, not hard power. And we follow those people willingly because we wish to, not because we fear or we feel that we have no other choice. And there's a very big difference between the two. I think that willing followers are confident that, well, let me step back. There are libraries that have been written about how to become a leader, books and books and books and books and essays. But I do think that it boils down to sort of the most important thing is building a relationship between a leader and those that he or she wishes to lead that is characterized by a very strong mutual confidence. And I don't say that lightly. As I started saying, willing followers are confident that their leader is on the right way because he or she articulated it, communicated it, explained it repeatedly, and in a way that they can understand and where they can ask questions and get answers. I think that willing followers feel that they know what they need to do and that they can do. They feel that they are led by somebody who, if they do have a problem they cannot solve, they can go to and will have calmly sit down and actually be able to resolve it. So I think the first challenge of leadership is actually to earn the confidence of those that you want to lead. But it's got to be reciprocal. So confident leaders actually trust that their followers understand what the direction is because they have this ongoing conversation that Jaime was talking about all the time. So they understand it. I think confident leaders trust that people or followers, or whatever you want to call them, know what they need to do and will do it because they have picked those people, they have worked with those people, they have put them in the right place, and they have explained to them in the context of what they're doing why they're there. They trust that those people will raise a problem if it comes up because of the kind of environment that both gentlemen sitting on both my sides have mentioned. But this confidence cannot be taken and given idly. I think the second challenge of leadership is to not only build that team that you are willing to trust, but then to actually have the guts to do it. And this is actually pretty important. You mentioned that. It is to actually then behave in a way that proves that that's what you mean. And that's a little more rare than people think. If I can take just a couple more minutes on that. Horatio Nelson, everybody knows about him, was a great military leader, if ever there was one. And I think most people in the room know that he's very famous for the signal that he sent for the Battle of Trafalgar that said, England expects every man to do his duty. Now, his original draft, that was actually changed by his flag lieutenant, said, England is confident that every man will do his duty. His man, who had been led as opposed to ruled under his command for his entire life, actually followed his intent. I think that true business leaders or true leaders are confident that their people will do the right thing. Rulers expect that their people will do the right thing with all the, and if not, therefore, which sort of is behind that verb. And I think it's a huge difference. It is even more true today than perhaps, even more important today than in Nelson's time, because I think that talented people really are less tolerant with being ruled. They want to be led. So I think that 200 years after Nelson and 100 years after Dean Gay, when you hear that leadership has to fundamentally change in order to adapt to globalization in complex times and issues like what we're following today, or we're facing today, I think that's actually fundamentally wrong. The tools that leadership needs to use, they have evolved and they will continue to evolve, and I have some ideas. I know everybody here has some ideas about this. But the key task of leadership, which is to create that relationship of mutual confidence, is still imperative. And some people are born true leaders. I think most people learn how to be leaders, trial and error, watching other people, choosing your mentors. I think the most important thing is that you need to understand that there is a choice. Most people don't even think about the difference until confronted by it. There's a choice that you can make. I think people need to internalize the difference between being a ruler and being a leader, and then decide which they will be.
Orit, but right now, one of the challenges that I think we have is that the business community as a whole has begun to lose a little bit of this trust that leaders need to have to allow their people to feel confident in them. If anything, many people these days, if you take the common person's view of leadership, it's that we're rulers, and greedy rulers on top of that, who have plundered and pillaged and left the populace in the worst place possible. In that environment, what do you think we need to do to restore first the general trust that we have as a business community? Because it's only if you restore that general trust that each individual then can also develop this relationship that you talk about. So any thoughts on our panel? Yes, Jaime?
My reaction to that, Nathan, is that building trust is a long-term process. It's not a short-term process. We all live in different communities. We all work with different constituencies. And you build trust over the long term. You don't build it on the day of the emergency. And while I agree with Jaime that there are moments of crisis where you need to focus, roll up your sleeves, and do what you have to do, I think the hardest thing for someone in a position of leadership is, while doing that and while taking care of a crisis, you need to at least find some time to keep the perspective in place. We've been a little lucky in Asia. What has happened here in the United States is unprecedented, and the flow will eventually hit us in a much bigger way in Asia. But we've been, by our standards in Asia, through some very, very difficult times. Back in 1997, for many who do business in Asia, was a terrible time in Asia. We had a collapse of many systems, obviously in a smaller scale to what you're seeing today. But you had, for example, market capitalization to GDP ratios in Thailand go from 84% down to 15%. They haven't recovered back to the old rates over these last years. You had the Indonesian rupiah devalued by 700%. People with foreign exchange exposure who had debts were caught in a terrible maelstrom. But there are groups who've been through that. What is happening now, nobody would wish on anyone. But if seen in the perspective that we have been through these cycles before, you go back to some rules, some tools that you turn to then. And so I think the hardest thing in a moment of crisis like this is not to have the focus so engaged in the day-to-day that you lose sight that these things do pass. And you have to do all the things that are necessary to be able to bridge into that new cycle. And maybe in Asia, we've just been a little bit luckier. We've had a great deal of volatility in our economic climate, I guess, over the last 20 years. And we have been hit hard over the years. But I think all of us have to just keep the perspective that these things at some point will pass. And while we have to manage on a day-to-day basis and take care of crisis situations and make quick decisions, I think all of us at the very top as well have to take a step back and see how these things pan out over longer periods of time and see how we can end up at the end of the game. And going back to the issue of trust, it's something you have to build on from day one, because the day that you need it, you want it to be there. If you don't build it from the very beginning in the community that you're working with, and that's the challenge that I faced in a very different environment to the ones you face here in the US, then it's very hard to pull that up as a resource when you need it in a moment of crisis.
Yeah. Jaime, as we, everybody is forecasting that there's going to be more regulation in the financial sector and perhaps in business as a whole. In some ways, one might argue that this regulation has been brought upon us by this loss of trust. And who knows how far it will go. It might affect executive compensation in addition to the things that it's already affected. What do you think it will be like to lead in a world in which at least the forecast is for a lot more regulation?
I'm not, first, I'm not afraid about more regulation, not regulation. We're heavily regulated. And, usually when there's a crisis, any kind of problem, what you got to do is sit back and say, what were the legitimate complaints that need to be fixed? What are the ones where you're pandering to a mob, which I think we do a lot. We oversimplify things, and there will be a lot of change. There are a lot of legitimate complaints, things that went wrong.
What are some examples that you would say were legitimate complaints?
Well,
what are some that you might say?
Look at executive comp, okay? There were a lot of people who made a lot of money who, in hindsight, didn't deserve it. That's a fact. That doesn't mean everyone was that way. That's true in baseball. It's true in sports. It's true in movies. It's true in... there was a lot of things that I look back at, I won't go through CDO squareds or, what the hell were we thinking? I mean, they were just too complicated for rational people. On the other hand, it wasn't all one side the other way. So we need good, rational regulation, okay? And people said, well, the Federal Reserve did a great job, but it didn't stop some of the people they regulate from blowing up. And there were a lot of unregulated people who blew up. So it wasn't whether you're regulated or not regulated. So there are problems, over leverage, SIVs, the whole mortgage business was basically underregulated. And by the way, this is like the 10th time that real estate's brought this country to its knees. This is not the first time. So maybe we'll learn that lesson one day, and you just go back through all these crises of the past. So to me, we'll form out good regulation, and hopefully it's done thoughtfully and not out of anger. And policy done in a rush can really have adverse consequences. Honestly, regardless, JPMorgan will do fine. I mean, so I don't sit here and worry about that JPMorgan somehow the regulations are going to change our nature, our ability to do a good job for shareholders or for customers, which is why we're here. I think we'll be fine. So we're going to be engaged. I think one of the lessons of all this is that business people also need to be far more deeply engaged in Washington. We may not like it, we're not used to it. It's complex, it's balancing and trade-offs and compromises, but it's important that we get involved. And it's also important when you go that it's not always a completely self-serving tax policy. It's what's right for the long-term health of the country. Get engaged in setting up policies that work, to allow people to compete, and globally. You can't set U.S. regulation and have it ignore what's going to go on overseas. There has to be some balance that makes it fair for companies here. And I also, this thing about trust in government and trust, the American population, maybe the population of the world, and if you read history, we've seen this consistently. And oversimplification of issues and facts and kind of mob thinking, and politicians who say all the time, not politically feasible. Not that it's wrong, just not politically feasible. So our politicians aren't leading. They're just, well, my constituent doesn't like this, or well, it doesn't mean that they should just listen to what the uneducated part of a constituency thinks. Some of these people have no idea what they're talking about, and we shouldn't lie about that. We should be honest about that. And I'll leave you with one last thought. American business, okay? Honestly, we do business with big businesses, medium-sized businesses, small businesses, and individuals. Who do you think are the most honest? Okay? And so it's just a lie to act like somehow every businessman is crooked. Most businesses, and I know I speak for everyone up here, philanthropic, charitable, we help inner city schools, we help kids get training. We do everything we're asked in every possible reasonable way, and then you get vilified up there like somehow there's something wrong with what you did. I think that these companies are more charitable than the average congressman, and probably more honest than the average congressman. And so,
Jaime, that's a...
But where we've made mistakes, people should be punished. Like, that's just what should happen. So I'm not saying no one was to blame for anything. Yeah, there's people made mistakes, and there should be appropriate, whether it's punishment or whatever form of it should take place too.
Yes.
Just to add one thing, I couldn't agree more. I guess it is a Harvard Business School kind of thing to say I couldn't agree more, but I couldn't agree more. But I think there's some things that actually, we were talking before this panel started, and we're saying, where are the grown-ups in the world? We nobody really knows what to do, and where are the grown-ups? We all thought there was somebody out there. And the reality is there are no 21st century institutions that are built to deal with the kind of issues that we're talking about. And it's not clear to me where this will come. It took World War II and the Depression first and then World War II to build 20th century institutions that dealt with things. Right now, there's no 21st century institution to deal with that. So you saw what happened in the United States on one hand and in Europe on one hand, although it's really not a worldwide institution. You can't take, except for very unique leaders, like FDR, for example, who his first thing was that we have nothing to fear but fear itself, where he started to build trust just by saying that. I turn on television in the morning and I see something like, well, all we have is fear, kind of thing. Well, that's not very confidence-inspiring. So there are some things that literally the people who are the grown-ups right now in our society have to start thinking about how to communicate. And it's not just CEOs, it's also those people that you're talking in politics, everybody's looking to.
There's one, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So, but it's got to be, we have got to really, and the Harvard Business School at least can do that, train people to think globally. The nations are relatively recent. It's a 19th century invention. And up till recently you had villages and you had towns, then you had nations, and you had rulers or leaders decided whichever way they want. And they decided what was good for the people within the boundaries of that place. Now the economy has gone way beyond that. It really is connected, and each one here is part of a global company. And yet the politics are still pretty national in scope. And the more people are taught, and that goes back to what can Harvard Business School do, to not only understand that you're operating in a global business, but to understand what it means. This is not anymore international. This is global. This means that you have to understand the politics not only in the United States, but in all the countries that you deal with. This means that you need to bring perspectives that are very different to the ones that you grew up with. This means that you need to have companies that are very diverse. A real global company, I can think of one in Europe, for example, which is one of the largest companies in the world. Their entire management board is a Swiss company. There's only one Swiss person on it. Those kind of things, and that means there's real diversity. That means there's more tolerance. There's more ability for new ideas to come in. I always find it's very dangerous when people are only talking to other people who are experts in the same things they are, because then you become pretty myopic. You've got to actually broaden your own and definitely your company's ability to take advantage of other expertise or other important things that are happening in the world and integrate it into the way you are thinking, because that's how you will recognize patterns and actually be able to not predict, but to see some things before they happen to you in your own industry, because they might have happened elsewhere. And I'm not just talking about other businesses. I'm talking about understanding biology. We were talking about before that, understanding science, understanding arts. That you can't be a generalist, but you can be an expert generalist, if you will.
Let's use Orit's cue and talk a little bit about what you think we should be doing at Harvard Business School to educate leaders that will be better prepared for the 21st century. Orit talks about globalization a little bit. Rick, what would you argue we should be thinking more about?
I mean, I would pick up on Orit's point. This issue of diversity of the student body and the faculty, I think, is fundamental. Because you just don't get it until you have people sitting around the table or around the classrooms and Aldrich halls, which really do bring different perspectives. And so much of leading in today's world is being able to listen, assimilate, and come up with solutions that work more robustly across a broader range of cultures that are quite different. And I would say, at the risk of emphasizing the obvious, because we all do, but nothing like getting out and being elsewhere. And we have a systematic approach to try to ensure that what we think future leaders live outside their home countries for extended periods of time, wherever they are in whatever country they come from, simply because you don't realize what it's like until you are living and you are the minority or the new guy or whatever. And I would say for me, the best thing that happened to me in my business career was very early. I was sent down to Brazil, and it was terrific in every way, but there was a feeling, hey, this isn't just a U.S. centric world, and hey, these people who work at GM do Brazil are just as much part of General Motors as the ones who work in Flint, Michigan. And I think anything that HBS can do to engender that understanding of how to work within this new world, and it isn't international, it's globally integrated, as a matter of fact, is something that will really help train future leaders in a direction that seems to be inexorable and picking up the pace, actually.
Jaime?
Yeah. 5 points, I guess, with respect to HBS and the future. The first, it picks up from what Rick was saying. We're really living in a world of far more complex, much more complexity in the macroeconomic environment. We're interrelated in many ways. The financial industry has become far more global over the years, but many other things are happening. People are moving across boundaries in different ways. Goods and services are moving across boundaries in different ways. That complexity, I think, needs to be elevated a little bit in the curriculum at school. Yesterday, we listened to Neil Ferguson, a historian. He gave an extraordinary perspective on finance over the ages, over spans of time that moved beyond a decade, through centuries. I think it's important for students to understand and have a sense of history on events that have happened and have a broader perspective before focusing on the smaller items. So that would be one. Number two, a topic I discussed earlier. I do believe more and more, particularly in our part of the world, there is an implicit social contract that business has and the private sector has with society as a whole. The mantra, I guess, that we all picked up in the 70s and 80s was, focus on your stockholders, your customers, your suppliers, and that's about it. I think we have to build trust as a community in a bigger way, in a more fundamental way, in a deeper way with the communities we serve. And that will go, I believe, beyond the traditional role we all have in our products and services. Certainly it's very relevant in our part of the world where the disparity in income is huge and large institutions are looked at with suspicion. You have to build trust in completely different ways with communities. The third item, I feel very strongly about. Living in the Philippines. We're a volatile environment. Ever since I started working, we've had ups and downs. I think students must be aware that downturns do come. I think you're all very lucky in the U.S. You're all very lucky in the U.S. You have long swaths of time of progressive growth, and that's wonderful. I think it's what makes the institution strong, and I have no doubt that the country will recover very quickly from everything that's happened. I have absolutely no doubt. But it's very important for young people to understand that recessions do happen, bad times do come, and you don't want them in a panic. You don't want them in a state of shock when these things happen. Now, how does one integrate that into a curriculum? That's harder to do, particularly when you live in a very progressive environment like the U.S., but that must be made very clear. These things do happen. Many of us in other parts of the world live with this. Through decades, we have swings that happen very often. We get used to it. We naturally become more cautious in the way we do things. But a young person that doesn't have that perspective can go through a decade of just growth and thinks that there is no other, there's no other result that comes out, and get caught flat-footed at a more senior position when these things happen. The fourth item is the public versus the private. I think Jaime was alluding to that. This issue of the private sector, the public sector, regulation, free market, it's moved up again on the agenda. And I think all of us must understand the pluses and minuses of it. I don't come out one way or another. I just think that the debate must be taken up to a new level. We've accepted a way of life until now, and that way of life is changing for all of us. For all of us in Asia, you all have to understand, we have gone through great difficulties in the 80s and the 90s, and the big multilateral institutions, a lot of them funded by the developed world, told us what the rules were. You had to let the chips fall where they have to fall. Government shouldn't intervene. Short selling is a wonderful thing. Just accept it. I remember those discussions. All of us who were living in the Southeast Asia, we lived with this, and we were taken up by shocks. But that was the mantra. And now there's a different, there are different rules that are being applied. I'm not saying that any country should not do what they have to do. That's it. But we must be very careful about the solutions we prescribe to others. And let's also look inwardly and see, what are the rules that work, what are the ones that don't. And so this public-private issue has to be debated a little bit more. Finally, my fifth point is there must be a new way to look at the growth equation. All of us, as private sector individuals, will come out, and the mantra of growth is there. I mean, all of us as CEOs, if we don't grow, we're told to step down, and unless we have a growth agenda in our business. Yet here we have an unprecedented moment in history. Food crops are moving up, prices are moving up to astronomical levels in our part of the world. You've got this huge competition for natural resources as countries like China and India begin to move up into a whole different stage of development. There is unprecedented tension for natural resources, for food resources, and yet the agenda we all have is growth. When there is going to be so much more tension that's going to exist and that growth will demand from all of us, there must be a more holistic solution to finding ways where we all win, rather than one wins and the other one loses. The tension will be much higher for all of us. There will be an inordinate competition for resources, food, and many other things that keep our economies growing. Yet we all focus on just what we need. And I think, as we've seen, we're all linked in whole new ways. There must be an agenda, I think, at the business school that begins to look at a more holistic, sustainable growth solution, rather than one where you as an institution move on. And I think for all of us as leaders, I hope that as one moves on over time, there is some respect given to prudence, sitting back a little bit, and that the investor community as well gives CEOs a bit of a break. As we look at the large companies in the US, I belong to a much smaller institution in our part of the world, but the large ones, you CEOs have unprecedented amounts of pressure put on you to keep the growth agenda on the table. If you're prudent on 1 year and hold back, chances are you'll be probably vilified. And yet, the demands of the job sometimes require you to just sit back and say, you know what, this is a period where we just have to just take it a little bit easy, become stronger, and the growth agenda will come back. And so I think that issue also has to be put on the agenda.
Okay. Jay?
So,
Jamie, any thoughts you have?
I mean, a couple of quick. First, I think the core of good leaders doesn't change. I think obviously it's much more global, much more diverse, but good leaders follow that. They're always learning from what's going on and stuff like that. And you made a very good point about growth. This thing about when CEOs stand in front of audiences like this and investors, and the question is grow. How are you going to grow? And they do really dumb stuff. And in businesses where you're going to be taking a lot of risk, and now you're being paid, not being paid for this. I'm stealing from Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett says the best thing to do is send your sales force out to play golf. Growth could be a disease in itself, and the leader has to stand against that too and explain to the shareholder why we are not doing it. And that's why you see some companies doing better. And the third thing, which I think is really critical, is, I think for a lot of us up here, and a lot of people, humanity is more important than JPMorgan, and your family is more important than your company. And you spend all your time on the company because that's what you do. That's your best way to contribute to this world. And you have to be great citizens. Governments themselves obviously will play and will continue to play a critical role. But I look at the United States government. I mean, we have institutional sclerosis. We are unable to make the decisions to make this country healthy. We don't have the fortitude, the discipline, the facts, the information. I'll give you one example. I can give you 20. Energy. We've had this energy problem now since 1974. We deserve $4 a gallon gas. We're sending $700 billion a year overseas for oil, some of which goes to places that, that money gets used improperly. We don't have the fortitude to tax oil, to tax BTU. And then someone said to me, what a great sacrifice that would have been had we, Americans don't like to sacrifice. So our cars would have been a little bit smaller. If you taxed oil, then, alternative energy, instead of like having to pay ethanol and pay wind power, if people knew the cost of energy is going to be up here, we'd buy smaller cars, heat can plan better, there'd be hundreds of billions of dollars spent on alternative energy, and we would reduce our dependence by better refrigerators and better cars and better windows, and yet we simply don't do it, and that train is going to hit us again. Probably about 15 years. And so part of it is, I go back to this thing, we got to also help our governments understand they just can't go on as business as usual. Governments have sunk a lot of countries, okay, between their corruption and their stupidity and their policies based upon the madness of the crowd. They've done a pretty bad job too, and so we all have to get engaged to make sure that takes place better.
I mean, in some ways,
can I make a response to that? Because I agree with you, and thanks for your help on the gas tax. I spent a lot of... No, actually, I mean that. I spend a lot of time in Washington talking about energy and this idea that you can get people to buy vehicles they don't want to buy. We haven't been able to solve that. And so we say, well, elsewhere in the rest of the world where we build cars and people actually buy smaller cars because of fuel taxes, they go, well, we could never get a fuel tax increase in the U.S. And you say, well, if you don't do that, we're going to live this again and again and again for the next, until we run out of money. I would just go back to the point that I think, obviously, Jaime's comments about the political leadership are hard to argue with. I do think, and I think you alluded to this earlier, I would say, on the other hand, business, when we go to Washington, we probably don't do it enough. We probably do it when we want something. And no one on this stage, and probably no one in the audience, but on occasion, I've observed business people who go to Washington only to sell a very specific agenda which benefits their company and which we all know makes no sense for our country, our world, our economy. So this issue of a little more statesmanship on the part of business leaders is, I think, a critical ingredient as we expect more of our elected officials. I do think all of us need to make sure that, sure, we don't want to go down and sink ourselves, but at the same point, we have to be willing to put our time into what are bigger, better solutions for the economy. And we have to recognize not every time are you getting something that's optimal for your own company or maybe in your own industry, but it is building an economic base that provides opportunities that we'll all have in the future.
In some ways, this tension between, people say capitalism is fueled by self-interest, but equally, I think capitalism is protected if we pay attention to the social interest. I think the point that you're making is that, business people need more and more to at least be conscious of how they're serving the broader social interest, even as they pursue their own self-interest. Do you have any thoughts about how we at Harvard Business School could help our students develop a sense of this over time?
Well, for one thing, I think you and the Kennedy School should get together because, for example, this issue of taxes on oil. I mean, it was stunning to see 2 out of the 3 candidates that were running suggesting a holiday on taxes or on fuel taxes during the August.
You got to talk up a little bit.
I'm sorry?
You got to talk into your thing.
I do need to talk to this thing right then. If Jaime can't hear me, then nobody can. Okay. So what I was saying, it was stunning to me to see that in August, 2 candidates out of the 3 that were running were asking, thank you, Jaime, by the way, were asking for a holiday on fuel taxes, which would, I mean, you can just, it was stupid beyond belief. And yet it was populist, and, there was only one guy who thought and said it was stupid. Sorry, I don't drive one of your cars. I drive a Smart. It's actually way cool, and it doesn't take any gas. And I spend a lot of time in Europe where they do tax oil, and that's just the way of living. I mean, obviously. And yet, Jaime and Rick are right. In our politics, it's not just that politicians are not willing to take the risk, it's the populace is not willing to elect them, and so we get into this vicious cycle. There is some education of all of the above, not just business, but also those people who are, let me not get into politics because it won't be nice but not pretty right now, but those people who really want what they want now, and those leaders who are need to be elected in order who need to actually listen to this in order to be elected. I wish there would be some leader who would say, get up and say, I want to be elected only for 4 years in this country. 4 years only. He or she won't accomplish everything they want to do. But if we start with energy, which to me is absolutely critical, and look how quickly it slipped from the agenda. A year ago, we were all talking about how important energy was, green, people, consumers were voting for that. Well, they haven't. They have voted with their pocketbook not to do it. The politicians have decided not to talk about it. It is not part of what we're talking about the elections here, and it's not part of what people are talking about in elections elsewhere. We can't that quickly just move from one thing to another. The only way that you can educate people to do that is to educate them in all aspects of the world. It's not just the business school who trains business leaders. It's not just the Kennedy School who trains political leaders. It is Harvard, perhaps, as a total sort of, and the education system that starts to actually think about in the 21st century, what are the most important things we're going to have to deal with? And it's not just short term, and it's not looking every day in the morning if the stock is up or the stock is down, because it's completely irrelevant to where the world is going. It's starting to behave like the grown-ups that I was looking for before.
You know, as a faculty member, one of the, speaking on behalf of many of my colleagues who are here, we're going to come back and start teaching in classes starting tomorrow when this grand celebration ends. What advice would you have for what we should be saying in our classroom starting now that's different? Is there something that you would urge us to bring a message to our students on advice that you would have for us?
You guys are the professors. We thought you knew everything.
I wish it were true. You know, this is the spirit of the school is always that we learn from practice. Are there things that you hope that the students that are coming out would take from us in the here and now?
I think Jaime raised a very good point that we have in the U.S. been fortunate to have very long upcycle, and so a lot of people haven't been through a down cycle. It's not true in most of the rest of the world, and while these are difficult periods, they are great chances to reset, learn a lot, and get yourself structured up for the future. So I think this ability to learn from challenging times is a good skill, and in some cases, more U.S.-based education doesn't pick that up as fast as it does in Brazil or perhaps in your experience. So certainly you have a live opportunity to talk about that, I think.
Okay. Listen, I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for having enlightened us on your views and leadership. These certainly are challenging times, and I wish you all the best in serving your institutions and leaders. And this is a time when I think we need more leadership, and thank you for your thoughts today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank
you. That was fun.
I want to take just a moment to particularly thank our four panelists for being with us in this difficult time. Putting Harvard Business School on the agenda today meant a great deal to Dean Light, to myself, and the whole group, and so I want to thank you for an extraordinary presentation. My Phil's 5 pages worth of notes. Terrific. Terrific.
Thank you.
James.
Great job. Well done.